Hey guys, Mr. Eschbacher here, and today we're going to talk about getting ready for that DBQ on May 15th. So, again, the AP test will be a 45-minute DBQ. You'll have 45 minutes to write and then 5 minutes to upload your answer. The test is May 15th at 2 p.m. We'll talk more about the particulars of that test as information comes at us from the College Board. I've already sent you some stuff on that. But since we know it's a DBQ, we need to work the heck out of that. And I couldn't think of a better possible topic, one that shows up a lot for DBQs, than American foreign policy. And I'm going to try to give you big picture themes to practice DBQs that I know pop up a lot for periods 1 through 7. You should be following at home along, I should say. I printed out and I gave you a chart to print out, and I'd like you to take notes as we do it. All right. So when we write these essays, I always like to say to kids, look, number one, you cannot have a clean essay sheet. Back in the day, they used to give us your essay booklets after the test, and I would go look at the notes kids took, but more importantly, the markings they made. A lot of essay points are left because kids don't address every aspect of the essay. So as soon as you get that prompt, and we're not doing an elaborate thing here, you only have 45 minutes to write, but you need to say to yourself, look, what time frame is this essay testing? Are we talking about years? Are we talking about APUSH time periods? Are we talking about thematic time periods like the Gilded Age or Progressive Era? In this case, in this essay, we're talking 1789 to 1941. Ask yourself, what do I know about that time period? Hopefully, you know that's the first year George Washington took office. That's the year of our federal government started up as we know it today in 1941. I don't know what happened there. Keep your essay dirty. Don't let it get clean. What key vocab can I underline or circle in the essay prompt? Well, United States, and especially the term foreign policy. Guys, this is so important. Whoops. If you see foreign policy, or if College Board busts out America's role in the world, those are interchangeable. That means we have to talk about America dealing with other countries. Don't get sidetracked by stuff like women's rights or the U.S. economy when they're asking you for America's role in the world or foreign policy. Is this essay specifying social, political, and or economic factors? Ask yourself that. If you see the word societal, that means social. In this case, they just ask American foreign policy. We can kind of say political, but there could be social and economic factors there as well. As a general rule, guys, you should always look to try to answer every essay question in terms of social, political, and economic. What historical thinking skill is being tested? Is this a causation essay where they ask what factors led to? That's a cause, guys. What contributed to? That's a cause. Is this a comparison essay? They ask you similarities, differences. They ask you how things were comparable. They ask you to contrast things. Now it's a similarities and differences essay. You're making a Venn diagram. Or, of course, is it the dreaded continuity and change over time essay, where they ask you, look, during a time period, here, tell me what changed and tell me what stayed the same. Remember, if you have a causation essay, again, whenever you look for causes, look for social, political, and economic causes. If you're doing causes of the Civil War, economic causes could be tariffs, could be the difference between cotton plantations and northern factories. Political, the question of states' rights versus national supremacy. Social, abolitionists and the antebellum movement. Identify what factors caused an event. Make sure in your thesis you drive home the idea of which factor or factors were most influential and explain why. Acknowledge that there were other less important factors. Tell me why they weren't as important as the other one. When you look for causes, identify them. Are they long-term or short-term? Certainly the attack on Pearl Harbor was a short-term cause of U.S. involvement in World War II because we declared war the next day. but you could look at Axis aggression, appeasement, the Treaty of Versailles, all as long-term causes. What were the effects of these causes? Can you identify specific effects paired to certain causes? Did these causes lead to positive and or negative effects? Comparison essays. Again, if you see one like this, where they're asking you to look at two different things, to compare, to contrast, to flub that word there, hang on. Basically, make sure you do a Venn diagram. Don't overthink this. And again, those similarities and differences can be social, political, and economic. Ask yourself, what are those similarities and differences you see? What factors could have caused the differences? Guys, people naturally don't like change. What's the catalyst that caused the change? Why all of a sudden were people willing to do this? Why were these differences important? Did those differences lead to something positive or negative? Did they lead to one group being more successful than the other? Or were there differences caused by other factors? If two people have differing views on something, was it because of their background or their upbringing? Was one difference more important than the other? Why were those similarities important? Did two people have similar methods, similar goals? Is there a reason for the similarities? Did person one or organization one come first and person two piggybacked on the idea, just said, look, we have a different way to do it? Look for these things. You can't just identify similarities and differences. You have to explain why they matter. And of course, the dreaded continuity and change over time. Good old CCOT. Again, when you're looking at changes or continuities, they're social, they're political, they're economic. Identify, make sure you stay within the time period. What changed? What caused those changes? What were the lesser changes? Again, guys, remember, people don't like to change. So what caused a change to happen? Now, when we talk about lesser changes, sometimes it's very hard to see what's a continuity. But you can say, look, one change was really radical. The other one was not so much of a change. If you see a lesser change, guys, that's a continuity. Why did the changes take place? Why did they happen? What made the change happen? Were these a change for the good or the negative? And explain why. If it's continuity, did the existence of the continuity have a negative result? The fact that something continued on, was it bad? Explain why. All right, so let's get to the important part. We're going to look at the documents. I want you to pause this video and do hippos for this document, and I'll be back in a flash. Okay, guys, so hopefully you've done your hippos, and if you've done your historical context, you know that this was written during the administration of George Washington. 1796 was towards the end of his time in office. Washington was president. We were a little more than a decade removed from the American Revolution. We had our Constitution for less than 10 years. And in the same decade, the French Revolution has caused a war to break out between England and France. That's your historical context. Now you got to tell me why it matters. Why? Because Washington's administration had controversy. Alexander Hamilton, his Federalist Party, Thomas Jefferson, his Democratic Republican Party, they were arguing over whose side America should take. The Federalists with Hamilton were pro-British. Jefferson's party, the Democratic Republicans, they were pro-French. Washington, as president, in 1794, issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, where he said, no, America's going to be neutral. We're not going to pick a side. Why does this matter? Because it sets up why, now in his farewell address, remember, this is the address that Washington had published in the newspaper, telling the American people, I'm only going to serve two terms. And when I taught this to you guys, I explained it was more like G-Dubs kind of being a fortune teller with a crystal ball, warning Americans, watch out for political parties. They're going to cause division. Watch out for sectionalism in the country. And oh yeah, maintain neutrality. Getting involved in foreign affairs is going to cause problems. Connect that. You can't just state the historical context. Tell me why it matters. Who's the intended audience? The American people. Why does it matter? Because Washington's leaving office. He's not just pleading out to the voters. He's pleading out to the people who are going to be the future leaders of America to say, maintain this course I have. Purpose, again, to try to persuade people, look, Britain and France are still at war. If we take a side, it's going to hurt us. Point of view or bias. Just identify the fact that this is George Washington, the guy who first issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, and his bias in this situation is he's trying to convince the American people to go along with a policy he has already created. Outside information. John Adams ends up trying to maintain this when he has the quasi-war with France. He tries to keep us neutral. It leads to controversies like the XYZ affair and the Alien and Sedition Act. Thomas Jefferson tries to maintain neutrality with Britain and France when Napoleon is causing problems. And Jefferson makes a really big mistake, and it leads to the Embargo Act of 1807. Ultimately, the United States goes to war with Great Britain in the War of 1812. And synthesis. Can you connect this to another time period? Of course you can. Go back and examine America's foreign policy when World War I began, and in those years between World War I and World War II. Heck, go read up on the Neutrality Acts. By the way, before we go any further, make a note. Do you think this document is going to end up going with a continuity or change? And if you don't know yet, make sure you come back to it. Document 2. I'm going to pause now, and I want you to do hippos. All right. So, historical context. It's 1848. We know this is the antebellum period. We also hopefully know in 1848, they give you a hint right here in the document, the United States has gone to war with Mexico. In fact, this is the end of the Mexican War. So it's a time period where Americans are really fired up about manifest destiny. And if I say manifest destiny, you say, go west, young man, go west. But as we move west, it leads to questions, leads to controversy. Should we get involved in wars? What do we do with the territory we've taken from Mexico? Do we put slavery there? But it also leads to the question of, what do we do with this territory which we have already taken? You know, there were people who believed in the idea of manifest destiny. That was our God-given right to go out to the Pacific. But it also means we have struggles that are going to come about as a result of it. And when you see John Calhoun here talking about a constitution capable of endurance, he's kind of alluding to the fact that this territorial expansion is going to bring about some tough questions. Intended audience, it's Congress. That's not good enough. Why does it matter? Well, now that the war is over, we have to decide, will we allow this territory to be slave or free? Purpose. Calhoun is a Southerner. In fact, we like to say he's Mr. States' Rights. And Calhoun is going to try to argue not just for states' rights, but for the expansion of slavery in the West. What's his point of view or bias? Calhoun, again, is a Southern Democrat. He's pro-states' rights. He's pro-slavery. In fact, in the 1830s, Calhoun was the guy who authored the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, a document stating the idea that South Carolina could nullify or ignore federal law, in that case, a tariff. Calhoun will become someone who wants secession eventually. Outside information. This Mexican War is going to lead to all kinds of clashes. Whether it's Ralph Waldo Emerson writing that famous line, Mexico will poison us. Henry David Thoreau spending a night in jail and then writing an essay called Civil Disobedience because he refused to pay his taxes for the Mexican War. Or the Compromise of 1850, which failed to settle the question of slavery in the territories. In fact, made it worse because it created a strict fugitive slave law. Synthesis. Connected to something else. Well, maybe you're going to tell me how the Mexican War led to anti-war protests. Again, Emerson and Thoreau. Go way forward. Remember we played that song, Alice's Restaurant, later on, how that was an anti-war protest song. How people protested the draft in Vietnam, not just Alice's Restaurant, but by burning their draft cards. You could connect the Mexican War to the Spanish-American War because both were fought for the question of taking territories. And after the war, both had controversies. The Spanish-American War, you had the debate over imperialism. You had the creation of the Anti-Imperialist League, a group of Supreme Court cases called the Insular Cases. And the U.S. took the Philippines and kind of tried to squash the revolution of the Filipino people. You could connect this war, go back to the French and Indian War, aka the 7 Years' War, and how the controversies that came off of that war Britain's debt, abandoning the policy of salutary neglect, tightening mercantilism, the taxes, the different acts, how that led to another war, the American Revolution. Because we should know the Mexican War becomes one of the biggest causes of the Civil War. Now think, you've seen two documents. Which one seems like it might be a continuity? Which one seems like it might be a change? All right, here's document 3. It's a big boy, and I hope you recognize the name of the author. I'm going to pause for a second. I'd like you to hit the pause button and do hippos. All right, historical context. It's 1904. Teddy Roosevelt's the president, and America is just a few years removed from the Spanish-American War, where all you have to do is add water, shake, and boom, you got instant empire. After the Spanish-American War, the United States took the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico. Cuba was not a U.S. territory. However, it was very dependent upon the U.S. because of something called the Platt Amendment. In class, I did that little thing with hello, puppet. 1904, Teddy Roosevelt has also already negotiated the Hay-Buenaventura Treaty, the treaty that gives us the Panama Canal. Why does this matter? Because here's Teddy Roosevelt now giving a message to Congress. He's laying out what we now call the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The idea that the U.S. has not only the right but the duty to intervene in the Western Hemisphere. Gee, I wonder why Teddy would say that. Oh yeah, because that means he has the right to intervene and protect the Panama Canal. This is his big stick policy. This is one of the reasons why Teddy doubled the size of the U.S. Navy. He wanted that canal not just for trade, but also so that the U.S. fleet, its Navy, could go from one ocean to the other quickly to project power. Intended audience, it's Congress. Why does this matter? Teddy is trying to basically get Congress to go along with the idea. Now remember, Teddy tended to do first and then say thank you or sorry later on, but he's trying to get support in Congress for the idea that the United States and its armed forces should be the police power of the Western Hemisphere. Okay? Purpose, again, to outline this idea that the United States not only will intervene, but other nations, are you listening, Britain, should not. This is again called the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine in 1823 said, hey, Europe, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Now here's Teddy adding on, and oh yeah, by the way, we're allowed to interfere. This started because in 1904, Great Britain threatened to take over an island in the Caribbean because it couldn't pay off its debts. And the British said, look, we're going to take you over until we can come up with a plan for you guys to pay off your debts. And Teddy said, whoa, 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 whoa. No. We don't want any of you European guys getting involved in our part of the world. We will take over. We will make them pay off their debts. One historian said, the Roosevelt corollary and the Panama Canal turned the Caribbean Sea into an American lake. Whose point of view is this? It's Teddy's. But that's not good enough. He's an imperialist. Remember, before he was president, he was a jingoist. He was someone who glorified military action and war. And now here's Teddy, a president who not only believes in imperialism, but believes in having a strong military, trying to, create his policy saying, look, we will be the police power of the Western Hemisphere. Outside info. Talk about the Panama Canal. Go back and talk about the Spanish-American War. Or mention how later on it was the good neighbor policy in the 1930s of Herbert Hoover and FDR that essentially undid the Roosevelt corollary by saying, look, from now on we'll use arbitration and mediation. The U.S. did this in the 30s because of the economic depression and because, in the 30s things were getting hot and we were building up towards war and we wanted countries in our part of the world to have our back. You could mention how later presidents like Taft used dollar diplomacy. We're going to use American business might and money to influence countries. Synthesis. Go back in time, guys. Connect this to the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe issued the doctrine in 1823 after Napoleon had been defeated, when European nations were trying to reclaim lost colonies. You could mention the fact that the real author of it was John Quincy Adams, his Secretary of State. Point out the fact that the Monroe Doctrine was isolation. You could, a little bit more extreme than neutrality, but it was more similar to George Washington back in Document 1. And yet now in the late 1800s and early 1900s, that Monroe Doctrine was used as the basis for American foreign policy. You could even go forward if you remember JFK in the 1960s, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States intervened, threatened nuclear war, thought about invading Cuba, blockaded it, did a naval blockade in the 60s because the Soviet Union had put nuclear weapons in Cuba. You can tie that all back to the Roosevelt corollary. All right, document 4. I'm going to pause. Hit the pause button for me. Do your hippos. Okay, now, what they've told us at College Board is, of the 5 documents, one of them will be non-text, meaning it could be a picture, a cartoon, a map, a chart. So I had to give you one here. Historical context, it's the end of World War I. The United States Senate has just rejected the Treaty of Versailles and membership in the League of Nations. Why does that matter? Well, because they rejected the treaty because of Article 10 in the League of Nations Charter, which stated that if one member of the League were attacked, all of its members would join in to protect it. And that's going to set up why you see what you see in the cartoon. You could talk about the fact that Woodrow Wilson was unwilling to compromise and then had a stroke. And because he no longer had that mental capacity, and because he was so dug in and stubborn, he was not able to get the irreconcilables and the reservationists to go along. Intended audience, the American people. Making a commentary. Guys, I would not use intended audience for this one. Okay? Purpose. Again, to show the fact that the Treaty of Versailles had been rejected by the U.S. Senate. I would lay off of purpose. I love historical context here. If you're going to look at point of view or bias, you might say this person is a pro-Woodrow Wilson, in that Wilson proposed it and the Senate rejected it. Outside information, again, talk about the irreconcilables, the reservationists, talk about how World War I, many Americans felt like we'd been sucked into a war that we didn't want to fight in, with the Lusitania, the fact that American bankers and businesses had reasons for us to get involved in the war. You could talk about how this sets up American isolation and neutrality. You could mention the Washington Naval Conference and the Kellogg-Briand Pact in the 1920s, how it led to the Neutrality Acts in the 1930s, how it allowed the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, to become aggressive and expand. How without us, the League of Nations was weak. Synthesis. Go forward. Talk about how the United States was reluctant to get involved in the League of Nations because we were afraid it would get us involved in a war. Yet after World War II, we were the country that proposed this at the San Francisco Conference, the United Nations. How in 1950, American President Harry Truman went to the United Nations Security Council and had a military action when North Korea attacked South Korea. Now again, think back to, does this represent a continuity or does it represent a change? Oh, by the way, if you're doing synthesis, connect this document back to this one. Whenever you can connect two documents, if you can compare one document for another, in this case, how they show a similar point of view, and in this case, you see a different point of view, that's where you can get analysis points. All right, I'm going to let you hit the pause button. Do document 5 for me. All right, we got some other Roosevelt guy. It's historical context. These are the years between World War I and World War II. This is FDR's famous quarantine speech, where he's kind of throwing out there the idea that, look, the peace-loving nations must have an effort to oppose people who are going to violate treaties, who ignore basic human instincts, that you can't escape through isolation and neutrality. Historical context. This is 1937. In 1935, 36, and 37, Congress passed the Neutrality Acts, which were designed to keep us out of getting involved in a future war. Look those suckers up. Know what they did. This is also going to be a few years before an organization was created called America First, which I believe was 1940, led by people like Charles Lindbergh, who thought that FDR was trying to push us into war. They were opposed to it. FDR is taking grief from people like Father Charles Coughlin. Just a few years before this quarantine speech, There was a Senate committee called the Nye Committee that investigated why we got involved in World War I and came back with the idea that, we were sucked into this war by American bankers and businessmen, that Wilson provoked it, and that the United States never should have been involved in it. Keep in mind, though, Japan has already by this time attacked Manchuria, been expanding in the Pacific. This is a year before Hitler takes Austria and the Munich Pact, and FDR is giving this speech. Tie that in. Intended audience, it's the American people. Now, that's not good enough, but point out he was probably communicating by radio, which we know are the fireside chats. And FDR is gauging the interest and the attitude of the American people in this speech. He knows that Americans don't want to go to war, yet he's trying to lay it out there, at least start the framework that, look, we have a moral duty to get involved for peace, for justice, for the world. Now, FDR, this document didn't go over really well for him, but he was trying to lay that framework. Okay? Purpose, again, make the case that we might have to get involved in this war at a time. Again, tell me why the purpose is important. He has to do this. It's at a time where the Axis powers are getting more and more aggressive, and he's got to try to convince the American people. His point of view, his bias, he does not believe in isolation neutrality. He sees the threat that the Axis, especially the Nazis, pose not just to Europe, but to the rest of the world. Outside information. Talk about how later on FDR got Congress to modify the Neutrality Acts in 1939. The Cash and Carry Act was a part of the Neutrality Acts. The idea of the Lend-Lease Act. FDR giving the Four Freedoms speech. Connected to Pearl Harbor. Synthesis. This idea of the quarantine speech. Again, you could say violations of treaties, ignoring humane instincts. Connect this to why towards the end of the war, FDR proposed the creation of the United Nations. Go back. How does FDR's quarantine speech compare to document 1 with George Washington? Synthesize. Go outside the time period. Go after World War II, outside of period 7, and talk about how the United States would change its role during the Cold War, guys. All right. So now what I want you to do is we have our thesis again, and we are doing a continuity and change over time essay. And what I want you to do now is just brainstorm out. Look at the 5 documents. Remember, you have to use at least 4. And I want you to think, okay, brainstorm out for me. What stuff represents a continuity? What stuff represents a change? And just brainstorm information, whether it's outside info or document info. Hit the pause button. Okay, we're back. So if we're looking at these documents, document 1, this whole idea of neutrality. Now that's your first one, so that's going to give you a clue as to where we're going here. 1, 4 certainly represent the idea of continuity because in some way, shape, or form, they represent the idea of isolation and neutrality. Document 5, the quarantine speech. Teddy's document 3, the Roosevelt corollary. They certainly represent the idea of change. We're moving away from isolation and neutrality, more towards global involvement. 2, there's always one document, guys, that's really hard to figure out. And that's why I put this one on there. If I'm you right now, I'm looking at this Calhoun document, I'm running away from this sucker. Because you might say, look, the Mexican War is an example of a change because Manifest Destiny, we're taking territories. But it might be hard to get that based on the text. Now, if you understood that this was connected to the Mexican War and Manifest Destiny, fine. That would also represent a change. All right, plan your thesis. Again, make sure when you do your thesis, it responds to all parts of the prompt, that 70-30 ratio. It has to be a historically defensible claim, something that you can prove and has to be backed up by evidence, Not, there were many times when American foreign policy changed. There's nothing to prove there. State the idea that America has had a foreign policy that has changed over time. Although there were many changes, and get into that. Talk about how the United States at times went back the other way to that idea of neutrality. Acknowledge a counterclaim. In this case, there has to be a continuity, there has to be a change. Hopefully, you realize the change is the bigger one here, and that from time to time we go back to the idea of neutrality. Somehow, you have to either start your thesis with although or have however in the middle. Make sure you have your because statement. Use the word because, such as, or due to. Don't just tell me there were many changes. Tell me there were many changes, such as the Roosevelt-Corley-Monroe Doctrine, America's involvement in the war with Mexico. Or, as time went on, the United States fell back on its old faithful continuity of neutrality because or due to. Remember, your thesis can be one or more sentences, and you really should have it in your intro paragraph. All right, so again, now we're going to play in your intro paragraph. Like we've been doing all year, set the stage. Do the Wayne's World thing. Go back in time. Explain to the grader. Pretend the grader's your dumbest friend. How did we get to this point? Then write your thesis. Do that on the chart I gave you. Hit the pause button. All right, now brainstorm for your body paragraphs. Make sure for each body paragraph you have a topic sentence. Your topic sentence should go back to your thesis. So, if your thesis is about continuity and change, let's say you're going to do change first because you know change better. Then start off with a sentence that states, America has moved away from the foreign policy on different occasions and taken a more active role in world affairs. And then get the ball rolling. Brainstorm out what documents address it. Make sure you source it. Have one part. You just need one part. Now remember, for the AP test, you have to have 4 total documents. There are 5. You have to use at least 4. You might have 2 continuities. You might have 2 changes. You might have 3 and 1. But make sure you're clearly identifying that a document represents a continuity or a change and explain why. And make sure how that part of HIPPOs shows that it's useful. Okay? The whole idea is you're stating outside information, you're using a document, and then you are taking that one part of HIPPOs to back it up. You have to use 4 documents, and for this essay this year, you have to have 2 documents where you effectively use HIPPOs. Guys, be safe. Use it. Use more than 2. What if one's not very good, but you have 3 or 4 that get into HIPPOs? They are stating you need to have 2 very specific examples of outside information. That doesn't mean 2 sentences, 2 things that you set up. I would rather you guys puke as much outside info as you can. All right, I'll pause. You brainstorm out for what changed. Okay, now we're back. Let's do the same thing for continuities. Identify which documents represent a continuity. Source 2 of those documents and explain why that part of HIPPOs matters, and then give me lots of outside info, baby. I'll pause. You fill it out. Okay, we're back. Wrap up your conclusion, guys. And then I'll pause. Write your conclusion. Okay, you have 45 minutes to write, and now they will give you 5 minutes to upload that sucker. So say your prayers. Make sure you have your Wi-Fi. Don't let your little brother and sister be on YouTube and stuff like that. And that's how you write a DBQ. So your job is fill in the chart that you did, send that to me, and we'll go on from there. Here's the rubric too, by the way. I want you to see, this is the one College Board gave us. I want you to see specifically how you'll be graded. And if you want to continue looking at that, hit the pause button. Otherwise, I'm going to count to 5 in my head, and I'm going to sign off.